I never thought my own son would betray me at 65. The morning Brandon told me about the trial stay at Willow Acres, I was polishing my wedding ring at the kitchen sink of the estate Andrew and I built together. 43 years of marriage, a multimillion-dollar logistics empire, and countless sacrifices to raise the boy I thought would honor our legacy. Just for a few weeks, Mum, he said, his voice steady as if discussing quarterly earnings. The doctors think you need specialized care after your episode. There was no episode. But how do you explain a mother's intuition when the betrayal cuts this deep? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of my bedroom at Whitford Manor, casting familiar shadows across the hardwood floors Andrew and I had chosen together in 1982. I sat at my vanity, the same mahogany piece that had belonged to his grandmother, running my fingers over the silver brush set he'd given me for our 10th anniversary. Everything in this room told a story of our life together: the photographs from our European honeymoon, the dried roses from our silver anniversary, the small china figurines I collected from each city where we'd opened a new Whitford logistics terminal. At 65, I had thought my story was largely written. Widow of Andrew Whitford, co-founder of what had become Virginia's largest independent freight company. Mother to Brandon, who at 38 was finally stepping into the leadership role we'd groomed him for since childhood. I had planned to spend these years traveling, maybe writing the memoir Andrew had always encouraged me to start, certainly continuing my work with the Cedar Ridge Women's Foundation. The estate felt different that morning, though I couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the way the October air carried the scent of dying leaves through the windows, or how the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick with unusual urgency. I had always been sensitive to changes in atmosphere, a skill that had served me well during my years as CFO of Whitford Logistics. When I could sense market shifts before they appeared in the numbers. Brandon was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, his dark suit impeccable as always, his coffee steaming in the ceramic mug I'd made for him in a pottery class when he was 12. He looked so much like his father in profile: the strong jaw, the way he held his shoulders when he was thinking through a problem. But Andrew's eyes had always held warmth, even during our most difficult business negotiations. Brandon's eyes, I realized with a mother's painful clarity, had grown cold somewhere along the way. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said, moving to the coffee maker with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been making morning coffee in this kitchen for decades. "You're here early. I wanted to catch you before your day got started." He didn't look up from his phone, thumbs moving rapidly across the screen. "We need to talk about some things." The way he said some things sent a small chill through me. In business, I had learned to pay attention to the spaces between words, the places where people revealed more than they intended. Brandon's tone carried the weight of decisions already made, conversations I hadn't been part of course. "But first, tell me how Daniela is doing. I haven't seen her in weeks." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "She's fine, busy with her design projects." Another space between words. I had watched my daughter-in-law's marriage to my son slowly unravel over the past year, though neither of them had said anything directly. Daniela had always been warm, generous with her time and affection. Lately, when she visited, she seemed to be looking past us all towards some distant horizon. I poured my coffee, added the single teaspoon of sugar I'd allowed myself every morning for the past 30 years, and sat across from Brandon at the kitchen island. The morning routine felt suddenly precious, as if I were observing it from outside myself. "Mum, I've been talking with Dr. Harrison about your health." "My health is fine, Brandon." "You know that." The incident last month. There was no incident. The words came out sharper than I intended. I was tired after the foundation gala. I sat down to rest, And Mrs. Patterson overreacted when she found me closing my eyes for a moment. You were unconscious on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes. I was resting my eyes. He finally looked up from his phone, and in his expression I saw something that made my chest tighten. Pity. My own son was looking at me with pity. Dr. Harrison thinks you might benefit from a more structured environment. Somewhere with medical staff available around the clock, social activities designed for people in your stage of life. My stage of life. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care. And what stage is that? Exactly. Mom, you're 65. You live alone in a house that's too big for one person. You haven't been to the office in months. When was the last time you had a real conversation with someone your own age? Every word felt calculated, rehearsed. I had raised this boy, taught him to think strategically, to plan several moves ahead. Now I could see those skills being turned against me with surgical precision. I have friends. I have the foundation. I have responsibilities. That's exactly what I mean. You're trying to maintain commitments that would be challenging for someone half your age. I studied his face, looking for traces of the child who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms, who would spend hours in my office at Whitford Logistics, pretending to type important letters on my old computer. Where had that boy gone? When had he learned to speak to me as if I were a problem to be solved rather than his mother? What exactly are you suggesting? Willow Acres? It's a beautiful facility just outside town. I drove by yesterday to look at it. The grounds are gorgeous, and they have an excellent reputation for caring for people who are transitioning into their golden years. Golden years. The phrase felt like cotton in my mouth. I had spent the past 3 years since Andrew's death fighting the assumption that my useful life was over simply because I was a widow past retirement age. The board members who suddenly spoke over me in meetings, the business partners who started directing their questions to Brandon instead of me. The way people smiled at me now, kind, patient smiles that said they thought I was already halfway to invisible. I'm not transitioning into anything, Brandon. I'm living my life. I know you think that, but I think that because it's true. I stood up, needing to move, needing to feel my own strength. I run 6 miles every Tuesday and Thursday. I read 3 newspapers every morning. I can recite the quarterly revenue figures for every division of Whitford Logistics from memory. What exactly suggests to you that I need to be warehoused with other people you've decided are no longer useful? It's not warehousing, it's community. It's support. His voice took on the patient tone he might use with a difficult client. Look, I've arranged for you to visit Willow Acres tomorrow afternoon, just to see what it's like. Dr. Harrison thinks it would be good for you to have options. The word options hung in the air between us like smoke. I had been negotiating contracts and managing complex business relationships for over 30 years. I knew when someone was presenting a foregone conclusion disguised as a choice. And if I don't want to visit this place, then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But his eyes had already crossed that bridge. I could see it in the way he was looking at me, as if I were a liability that needed to be managed, rather than a person whose wishes mattered. After Brandon left, I walked through the house Andrew and I had designed together, room by room, the library where we used to read on Sunday mornings, him with his business journals, me with whatever novel had caught my attention. The sunroom where I still took my afternoon tea, surrounded by the plants I'd been nurturing for decades. The office where I'd worked late into the night during Whitford Logistics' early years, balancing books and negotiating contracts, while Brandon slept upstairs. Each room held layers of memory, years of decisions and conversations and quiet moments that had shaped the life I'd built. I had assumed that life would continue, that I would have some say in how it evolved. The possibility that my own son might have different plans had never occurred to me. I found myself in Andrew's study, a room I rarely entered anymore because it still held too much of his presence. His desk was exactly as he'd left it, covered with the papers he'd been reviewing the morning before his heart attack. I sat in his leather chair and opened the bottom drawer, where he'd kept the company's original incorporation documents. The pages were yellowed now, but the language was still clear. Whitford Logistics Group, founded in 1985 by Andrew James Whitford and Victoria Aylana Whitford. Equal partners in every sense of the word. I had insisted on that language, despite the lawyer's suggestion that Andrew be listed as primary founder. We had built this company together, decision by decision, sacrifice by sacrifice. As I read through the bylaws we drafted so carefully all those years ago, I noticed clauses I'd forgotten about. Protections we'd built in to prevent hostile takeovers or management decisions that could compromise the company's mission. Andrew had been paranoid about maintaining control, about ensuring that Whitford Logistics would never become the kind of soulless corporation that treated employees as expendable resources. Some of these protections, I realized with growing interest, were still in effect. Some of them might be very relevant to current circumstances. I spent the rest of the morning in Andrew's study, reading documents I hadn't looked at in years, remembering conversations we'd had about legacy and responsibility and what we owed to the people who had helped us build something lasting. By lunchtime, I had a very clear picture of exactly where things stood legally, financially, and structurally at Whitford Logistics, and I had some questions for my son. The drive to Willow Acres the next afternoon felt like a funeral procession. Brandon insisted on taking his Mercedes, claiming my Volvo wasn't reliable enough for the 20-minute trip to the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. I sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar landmarks slide past the window, each one feeling like a small goodbye. "You're like the activities director," Brandon said, his voice artificially bright. "She used to work at that resort in Williamsburg where you and Dad celebrated your anniversary a few years ago. Very experienced with people who appreciate the finer things. People who appreciate the finer things." Another euphemism, another way of avoiding the reality of what this place was. I had spent enough time visiting colleagues and friends in similar facilities to know exactly what lay ahead. Scheduled mealtimes, organized activities designed to keep aging minds occupied, gentle but firm guidance away from any decisions deemed too complex for deteriorating faculties. Willow Acres sat at the end of a tree-lined drive, a sprawling complex of connected buildings designed to look like a grand estate rather than an institution. The landscaping was immaculate, the kind of carefully maintained perfection that cost significant money to sustain. I could see residents walking along paved paths, some with walkers, others moving slowly, but independently. They looked pleasant enough, these people who had been convinced or coerced into giving up their autonomous lives. "It doesn't look so bad, does it?" Brandon's question carried the hopeful tone of someone trying to convince himself as much as me. "It looks expensive. Don't worry about the cost. We can afford it. Not as if the decision had already been made, as if my financial independence had somehow evaporated along with my supposed capacity for independent living. The tour began in the main lobby, a soaring space with crystal chandeliers and fresh flowers arranged in elaborate displays. Our guide was Sandra Morrison, the activities director Brandon had mentioned, a woman in her early 50s with the professional enthusiasm of someone accustomed to selling difficult concepts to skeptical audiences. "Mrs. Whitford, it's such a pleasure to meet you. Brandon has told me so much about your impressive career and your wonderful family." I shook her hand, noting the way she held eye contact just a fraction too long, the way her voice carried the particular warmth reserved for people perceived as fragile. I had seen this performance before, during Andrew's final weeks in the hospital. Medical professionals and institutional staff had a special way of speaking to family members they assumed were too overwhelmed to make rational decisions. "Thank you," I understand you have experience in hospitality. Oh yes, 15 years in resort management before I found my calling here. We like to think of Willow Acres as a permanent vacation, really. Our residents tell us they feel like they're living in a luxury hotel. She led us through a series of common areas, each one decorated with the kind of expensive but generic furniture found in upscale hotels. The dining room featured white tablecloths and fresh flowers, with residents sitting in small groups, their conversations punctuated by the gentle clink of silverware against china. The library was well-stocked but sterile, lacking the comfortable chaos of books that had been loved and reread. The game room buzzed with the sounds of cards being shuffled and gentle laughter. Everyone looked content. Everyone looked safe. Everyone looked like they had given up fighting for anything that mattered. Our medical staff is available 24 hours a day, Sandra continued, leading us down a corridor lined with numbered doors. We have a registered nurse on each floor, and Dr. Martinez makes rounds twice weekly. Many of our residents find tremendous peace of mind knowing that help is always just a button push away. What about visitors? I asked. Family members who want to stay involved in residents' daily lives. Oh, we encourage family involvement, of course. We have visiting hours from 10 to 8 daily, and family members are welcome to join residents. For meals with advance notice, many of our families find that the structured environment actually improves their relationships with their loved ones. I noticed she didn't address the question I'd actually asked. But residents are free to leave whenever they choose. Well, that depends on their individual care plans and what their families and doctors think is best. We've found that the adjustment period can be challenging, and sometimes what feels like a desire to leave is really just anxiety about change. Our staff is very skilled at helping residents work through those feelings. Brandon cleared his throat. Mom, why don't you ask about the activities? I know you'd be interested in their book club. But I was more interested in the medical evaluation forms Sandra had mentioned, the ones that would supposedly document my need for supervised care. I was interested in the care plans that might override my personal choices. I was interested in exactly what legal authority this place would have over my daily life if I were to become a resident. Could I see a sample of the evaluation process? I asked. The medical assessments that determine care levels. Sandra's smile flickered slightly. Those are confidential documents, of course, specific to each resident's needs. But I can assure you that our evaluation process is very thorough and conducted by licensed professionals. I'm sure it is. But I'd like to understand what criteria are used to determine whether someone needs assisted living versus independent living. Mom, Brandon interjected, why don't we finish the tour first? You can ask detailed questions later, but I could. Seeing Sandra's expression that there wouldn't be a later for detailed questions. This was a sales presentation, not an information session. The decision-making process, whatever it involved, would happen without my input. We continued through the facility, past the physical therapy room where elderly people worked with resistance bands and small weights, past the beauty salon where a woman was having her hairstyle for what might be the most significant social event of her week. Everything was clean, professional, designed to convince family members that their aging relatives would be cared for with dignity and attention. What was missing was any sense that the people living here had ongoing influence over their own lives. I'd like to speak with some of the residents, I said as we approached the end of the tour. Get their perspective on daily life here, of course. Let me introduce you to Mrs. Franklin. Teresa is one of our most dynamic residents. Teresa Franklin was sitting in the sunroom, a woman who appeared to be in her late 70s with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon and eyes that missed nothing. She looked up as we approached, and I saw her take in Sandra's professional smile, Brandon's nervous energy, and my own carefully neutral expression. Teresa, I'd like you to meet Victoria Whitford. She's considering joining our community, is she? Now, Teresa's voice carried the slight rasp of someone who had spent years speaking into microphones. And what does Mrs. Whitford think about that? I'm still gathering information, I said, taking the chair beside her. Smart woman. Information is always useful. Teresa's eyes shifted to Brandon, then back to me. Family decision or personal choice? The question hung in the air for a moment. Sandra started to respond, but Teresa held up one manicured hand. I was asking Mrs. Whitford. That's still being determined, I said carefully. Teresa nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. Well, when you're done with the official tour, come find me. I'll give you the real story. Sandra's laugh sounded strained. Teresa likes to think she's our unofficial spokesperson. I like to think I'm still capable of forming my own opinions about my living situation. Teresa replied smoothly. Novel concept, I know. As we walked away, I found myself looking back at Teresa Franklin. In her direct gaze and sharp tongue, I had recognized something I thought I was losing, the refusal to be managed. The ride home was quiet. Brandon seemed satisfied with the visit, as if my lack of vocal objection constituted agreement. I let him maintain that illusion while I processed what I had seen and heard. That evening, I called Dr. Harrison's office and requested copies of all my medical records from the past year. I also called our family attorney, Lena Ortega, and scheduled an appointment to review my personal legal documents. If Brandon was building a case for my incompetence, I wanted to understand exactly what evidence he thought he had. The medical records arrived by courier the next morning. I spread them across the dining room table and read through every page with the same attention to detail I had once applied to quarterly financial reports. The picture that emerged was of a woman in excellent health for her age, with no cognitive issues, no significant physical limitations, and no medical recommendations for supervised care. What I did find was a consultation note from 3 weeks ago, a visit I didn't remember scheduling. According to the record, I had requested an evaluation for increasing forgetfulness and anxiety about living alone. The note indicated that Dr. Harrison had recommended consideration of assisted living arrangements and had discussed options for family support in this transition. I sat back in my chair, staring at the document. The handwriting was Dr. Harrison's, but the words were not mine. I had never expressed anxiety about living alone. I had never requested an evaluation for forgetfulness. Someone had scheduled that appointment and had spoken for me during it. The phone rang as I was reading the consultation note for the 3rd time. Mrs. Whitford. This is Maya Chen from Willow Acres. I'm the care manager there. I understand you visited us yesterday. Yes, I did. I was wondering if you might like to come back for a more informal visit. Sometimes the official tour doesn't give people a real sense of daily life here. I'd be happy to show you around during a regular afternoon, let you see how things actually work. I found myself intrigued by her offer. When would be convenient? How? About tomorrow around 2. I'll be here anyway, and it might give you a chance to talk with Mrs. Franklin again. She specifically asked me to invite you back. After I hung up, I sat at the dining room table for a long time, looking at the medical records and thinking about the careful choreography of the past few days. The appointment I didn't remember, the consultation notes that didn't reflect my actual words, the tour of Willow Acres that had felt more like a preview than an exploration of options. Someone was building a case for my incompetence, document by document, conversation by conversation. The question was whether they had built it carefully enough to withstand scrutiny. I had a feeling I was about to find out. I returned to Willow Acres the next afternoon, this time driving my own car despite Brandon's protests about the unreliability of my aging Volvo. The irony wasn't lost on me. A 15-year-old vehicle was considered untrustworthy, while a 65-year-old woman was expected to surrender her independence entirely. Maya Chen met me in the lobby, and immediately I could see why Teresa Franklin had suggested I speak with her. Where Sandra Morrison had projected professional enthusiasm, Maya radiated genuine warmth tinged with something that looked like skepticism. She was younger than I'd expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with greying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she was accustomed to seeing through social pleasantries. "Thank you for coming back," she said, shaking my hand with a firm grip. "I thought you might appreciate seeing the place when we're not trying to impress anyone." She led me through the same spaces I'd toured the day before, but now they felt different. Residents moved through their daily routines without the heightened awareness of being observed. Conversations were quieter, more authentic. The staff interactions I witnessed seemed focused on genuine care rather than performance. "How long have you worked here?" I asked as we walked past the dining room. 3 years. "I came from hospice care, actually." Very different environment, but some of the skills translate. What skills are those? Listening to what people actually need instead of what other people think they need. Recognizing when someone is being heard versus when they're being managed. She paused near the library. "Can I ask you something directly?" "Please do." "Is this your choice, or is someone making it for you?" The question landed with startling force. I had spent 2 days dancing around this exact issue with Brandon, with Sandra Morrison, even with myself. Maya Chen had simply asked it outright. "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "That's a fair answer. Come on, let's find Teresa. She's been asking about you since yesterday." We found Teresa Franklin in her room, a space that immediately impressed me with its personality. Where many of the other rooms I glimpsed had the generic comfort of hotel suites, Teresa's space was distinctly her own. Jazz albums lined one wall, photographs covered her dresser, and a vintage radio sat on her bedside table. "Victoria, I was hoping you'd come back." Teresa gestured to a comfortable chair near the window. "Maya, would you mind giving us a few minutes? I want to tell this woman the truth about this place." Maya smiled and excused herself, closing the door behind her. "First things first," Teresa said, settling into her own chair. "This is not a bad place to live. The food is decent, the staff is generally kind, and they leave you alone if you make it clear you're not interested in being infantilized. But it's still an institution, and institutions have their own logic." "What do you mean?" "I mean, once you're here, leaving becomes complicated. Not impossible, but complicated. There are protocols, evaluations, family consultations. It's designed to make staying easier than going." I thought about Sandra Morrison's careful long answer about residents. "Freedom to leave." "How did you end up here?" "My choice, actually. Husband died, kids live across the country, and I was tired of rattling around in a house that had become too much work. But I was lucky I got to make that decision while I was still considered competent." She fixed me with a sharp look. "Are you still considered competent? By whom?" "By the people who matter in these situations, family members, doctors, lawyers." I told her about the medical consultation I didn't remember, about Brandon's sudden concern for my welfare, about the tour that had felt more like a preview of my future than an exploration of options. Teresa listened without interruption, nodding occasionally in a way that suggested she was familiar with this particular story. "Have you seen your medical records?" she asked when I finished. "Yes, there are some discrepancies." "I'm sure there are." The medical system makes it very easy to build a case for someone's incompetence if you know which buttons to push. Concerned family member, isolated elderly person, a few carefully worded consultations. She leaned forward. "What does your gut tell you?" "That my son is lying to me about something important. then trust your gut. At our age, intuition is about the only thing that gets sharper instead of duller. Maya returned with tea, and the three of us spent the next hour discussing the practicalities of life at Willow Acres. Teresa was frank about both the benefits and limitations. The medical care was excellent, but residents had little say in their treatment plans. The social activities were well organized, but participation was strongly encouraged in ways that made refusal uncomfortable. The facility was beautiful and well maintained, but personal autonomy was gradually eroded through 1,000 small policies and procedures. The thing you have to understand, Teresa said, is that this place operates on the assumption that elderly people can't be trusted to make good decisions about their own lives. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it isn't, but the system doesn't distinguish. It treats everyone like they're one step away from wandering into traffic. What would you do in my situation? I asked. I'd figure out what your son is really after. Because in my experience, when adult children suddenly become concerned about their parents' welfare, it's usually because something else is at stake. As I drove home that afternoon, Teresa's words echoed in my mind. What was Brandon really after? What had changed to make my continued independence suddenly problematic? I spent the evening in Andrew's study, this time focusing on more recent documents. Bank statements, investment portfolios, corporate reports from Whitford Logistics. The financial picture was complex, but several patterns emerged that I found troubling. First, Brandon had been moving money. Nothing illegal, but significant transfers between company accounts that didn't align with normal operational needs. Second, he had been having conversations with potential investors that I hadn't been informed about. Third, there were consulting fees being paid to firms I didn't recognize for services I couldn't identify. Most concerning was a preliminary agreement I found buried in a stack of corporate correspondence. Whitford Logistics was apparently in discussions with a national freight consolidator about a potential merger. The preliminary terms would make Brandon CEO of the combined entity while relegating me to an advisory role with no operational authority. I read through the document twice, my understanding crystallizing with each paragraph. This wasn't about my health or my competence. This was about Brandon positioning himself to control a company worth $37 million without interference from the woman who still owns 60% of it. The timeline made sense now. The medical consultation I didn't remember. The sudden concern about my living situation. The tour of Willow Acres with its emphasis on family decision-making and professional medical oversight. Brandon needed me, declared incompetent, to proceed with his plans. A woman in assisted living, particularly one whose medical records documented cognitive concerns, would have much less credibility in any challenge to corporate decisions. Her son, acting as a healthcare proxy and presumably her financial agent, would have broad authority to make choices on her behalf. It was an elegant plan, really. Ethically reprehensible, but strategically sound. I picked up the phone and called Lena Ortega's emergency number. Lena, it's Victoria. I need to see you first thing tomorrow morning. And I need you to bring every document related to my corporate ownership in Whitford Logistics. Victoria, it's 11 o'clock at night. What's wrong? I think my son is trying to steal my company. I'll be there at 8. After I hung up, I sat in Andrew's chair and looked around his study. For the first time since his death, I felt his presence not as loss, but as partnership. He had always been paranoid about protecting what we'd built. Now I understood why. Somewhere in these carefully crafted legal documents, in the bylaws we'd written together and the protections we'd built into our corporate structure, was the ammunition I needed to fight back. I just had to find it before Brandon completed his coup. The next morning, Lena arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, carrying a briefcase that looked like it could stop a bullet. She had been our family attorney for over 20 years, had seen us through Andrew's death and the complex transition of business ownership that followed. If anyone understood the legal landscape we were navigating, it was Lena. "Show me everything," she said, settling at the dining room table with a cup of coffee and the focused intensity that had made her one of Virginia's most respected estate attorneys. I spread out the documents I gathered, the medical records, with their suspicious consultation notes, the corporate papers detailing Brandon's financial maneuvering, the preliminary merger agreement that would effectively remove me from operational control of my own company. Lena studied each document carefully, occasionally making notes in her precise handwriting. When she finished, she looked up with an expression I'd seen before, usually just before she demolished an opposing counsel's argument in court. "Well," she said, "this is certainly ambitious. Is it legal? Most of it. Unfortunately, your son has been very careful to stay within legal boundaries while building his case. The medical consultation appears to be legitimate, even if the circumstances were misleading. The financial transfers are all properly documented. The merger discussions are within his authority as current CEO, but he's made several assumptions that could prove problematic." She pulled out a thick folder of documents. "Let's review your actual legal position." For the next 2 hours, Lena walked me through the complex web of corporate governance, ownership structures, and legal protections that Andrew and I had established over the years. The picture that emerged was far more favorable than I had expected. "The key thing to understand," Lena explained, "is that while Brandon has day-to-day operational authority as CEO, any major corporate action, including mergers, asset sales, or changes in ownership structure, requires approval from the board of directors. And you still control the majority of board seats through your shareholding position, even if I'm declared incompetent." That's where things get interesting. "You and Andrew were very paranoid about hostile takeovers. Remember, you built in protections against exactly this kind of situation." She pulled out a document. I recognized our original partnership agreement, updated multiple times over the years as the company grew. "Section 12, paragraph 4, she read. "In the event that either founding partner is declared legally incompetent, their voting rights and board positions will be held in trust by a designated agent until such time as their competence is restored or their estate is settled." I remember that clause. "But wouldn't that agent be Brandon?" "No. You designated me." Lena smiled grimly. "Both of you were very specific about wanting an independent party to hold those rights, someone who wouldn't have a personal financial interest in the decisions." I felt something loosen in my chest, a tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. "So even if Brandon succeeds in having me declared incompetent, he still can't complete a merger without approval from the board, which you control through me. And any competency evaluation would have to meet very specific legal standards. The medical records you've shown me wouldn't come close to meeting those standards in court. What about the assisted living placement? Could he force that?" "Not without a court order based on clear evidence of incapacity. And frankly, the evidence you've shown me suggests you're more competent than most people half your age." We spent another hour developing a strategy. First, I would request a comprehensive medical evaluation from an independent physician, establishing a clear record of my cognitive capacity. Second, Lena would review all recent corporate actions to ensure Brandon hadn't overstepped his authority. Third, we would quietly document any further attempts to manipulate my medical records or living situation. "The goal," Lena explained, "is to make it clear that any challenge to your competence will be met with overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Once Brandon understands that his plan won't work, he'll either back down or show his hand more clearly. And if he shows his hand, then we'll be ready for him." As Lena gathered her documents to leave, she paused at the door. "Victoria, can I?" Ask you something personal, of course. How did you miss this? You've always been incredibly perceptive about business relationships. What made Brandon's behavior seem normal until now? I thought about her question as I walked her to her car. How would I miss the signs that my own son was plotting against me? When had concern become manipulation and love become strategy? I said, finally, I stopped seeing him as a business partner and started seeing him only as my child. I assumed his motivations would always include my best interests. Dangerous assumption in family business, yes. But Andrew always said that trusting people was a choice, not a feeling. I chose to trust Brandon because he was my son. Now I have to choose whether to keep trusting him based on his actions. After Lena left, I found myself back in Andrew's study, but this time the space felt different. Less like a shrine to the past and more like a war room for the future. I had work to do, documents to review, strategies to develop. My son thought he could maneuver me into surrender by questioning my competence and isolating me from my support systems. He had underestimated two crucial factors: my actual capabilities and the legal protections his father and I had built into our company structure specifically to prevent this kind of betrayal. I was 65 years old, not dead. And I was about to remind Brandon of the difference. The independent medical evaluation took place the following Tuesday at the University of Virginia Medical Center, 2 hours from Cedar Ridge. I had specifically chosen a facility where Brandon had no connections, no relationships that might influence the assessment process. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Maya, despite the shared surname, was a geriatrician with 30 years of experience in cognitive assessment and a reputation for thorough, unbiased evaluations. The examination was comprehensive. 3 hours of cognitive testing, physical assessment, psychiatric evaluation, and detailed questioning about my daily activities, financial management, and decision-making processes. Dr. Chen was methodical and professional, but I could see her growing puzzlement as the test proceeded. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mrs. Whitford, she said, as we concluded the final assessment, I have to ask what prompted this evaluation. You're functioning at a level I'd expect to see in someone 20 years younger. I explained the situation carefully, showing her the medical records from Dr. Harrison's office with their concerning consultation notes. She reviewed the documents with increasing interest. This is unusual. The consultation notes describe symptoms and concerns that don't align at all with your current presentation. Either you've experienced a remarkable recovery in the past few weeks, or these notes don't accurately reflect your actual condition at the time. What would you recommend? I'd recommend that you request a copy of the audio recording from that consultation. Most medical offices record their sessions for liability protection. If there's a discrepancy between what was actually said and what was documented, that would be significant. I left the medical center with a clean bill of health and a new understanding of just how carefully orchestrated Brandon's campaign had been. Someone had either coached Dr. Harrison on what to document or had spoken for me during that consultation in ways that created a false record of cognitive decline. When I got home, there was a message from Maya Chen on my answering machine. Mrs. Whitford, this is Maya from Willow Acres. I was wondering if you could call me when you get a chance. There's something I think you should know. I called her back immediately. I hope you don't mind me reaching out, Maya said. But I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. I did some checking, and there have been several calls to our facility over the past few weeks from someone identifying himself as your son, asking about admission procedures and payment options. When were these calls? The first one was 3 weeks ago, the day after your consultation with Dr. Harrison, according to the date he mentioned. He was asking very specific questions about our memory care unit and what kind of medical documentation we require for placement 3 weeks ago. Before the tour, before any conversation with me about my living situation, Brandon had been researching how to place me in specialized care for cognitive impairment. Did he mention anything about timing? He asked how quickly we could accommodate a new resident if the right paperwork came through. He seemed to be working toward a specific deadline. I thanked Maya and hung up, my mind racing. A specific deadline suggested that Brandon's timeline was driven by something external, something that required my removal from active involvement in company decisions by a particular date. I called Lena and asked her to dig deeper into the proposed merger documents. If Brandon was working toward a deadline, there had to be external pressure driving his timeline. The answer came the next morning. Lena called at 7:30, her voice tight with anger. Victoria, we have a problem. I've been reviewing the merger documents more carefully, and there's a deadline we missed. The preliminary agreement has to be signed by November 1st, or the deal falls through. November 1st is next week. Exactly. And there's something else. I made some calls to contacts in the industry, and this merger isn't just about combining companies. The acquiring firm is planning to break up Whitford Logistics and sell off the pieces. The Virginia operations would be shut down within 6 months. I felt the room spin slightly. Andrew and I had built Whitford Logistics not just as a business, but as a cornerstone of the Cedar Ridge community. We employed over 300 people locally, supported dozens of local suppliers, and had structured our operations specifically to maintain strong community ties, even as we expanded nationally. How many people know about the breakup plans? Very few. It's not in any of the preliminary documents. I only found out through back-channel conversations with people who've worked on similar deals. Does Brandon know? I can't prove it, but the financial terms of his employment contract with the new entity suggest he's aware that his position would be temporary. He's negotiating for a substantial severance package and non-compete restrictions that would position him well for his next opportunity. The betrayal was even deeper than I had realized. Brandon wasn't just trying to steal my company, he was planning to destroy it for personal gain, leaving 300 families without jobs and a community without one of its largest employers. I spent the rest of the morning in Andrew's study, surrounded by documents and photographs from 35 years of building something we thought would last. Pictures of ribbon-cutting ceremonies, company picnics, the Christmas parties we used to host for employees and their families. Awards from the Chamber of Commerce, thank you letters from customers, newspaper articles about our contributions to local charities. All of it would disappear if Brandon's plan succeeded. At noon, Maya Chen called again. Mrs. Whitford, I hope you don't mind another call, but something happened yesterday that I think you should know about. What's that? Your son came by the facility with paperwork for your admission. He said you'd had another episode and that your doctor was recommending immediate placement in our memory care unit. My blood went cold. What kind of paperwork? Medical power of attorney documents, a physician's order for specialized care, and financial authorization for payment. He wanted to reserve a room starting Monday, November 1st. He said the timing was critical because of your medical condition. The pieces clicked into place. Brandon needed me in memory care by November 1st, the deadline for signing the merger agreement. With me in specialized care for cognitive impairment, and with him holding medical power of attorney, he would have broad authority to make decisions on my behalf, including corporate decisions that I was supposedly no longer competent to make. Maya, what did you tell him? I told him we'd need to speak with you directly before processing any admission, regardless of what paperwork he brought. He seemed surprised by that requirement. I imagine he did. Maya, can I ask you for a favor? Of course, if my son comes back with any paperwork or tries to make any arrangements regarding my care, would you call me immediately? And would you be willing to document those interactions in writing? Absolutely, Mrs. Whitford. I've been working in elder care for 15 years, and I've seen this situation before. Adult children who are more concerned with convenience than care. You deserve better. After I hung up, I sat in Andrew's chair and thought about the choice I was facing. I could continue gathering evidence, building a legal case, fighting Brandon through official channels. That would be the safe approach, the measured response of someone confident in their position, or I could go on the offensive. I picked up the phone and called Miles Booker, a business journalist who had written several articles about Whitford logistics over the years. Miles was young, ambitious, and had a reputation for thorough investigative work. Miles, this is Victoria Whitford. I have a story for you, Mrs. Whitford. Good to hear from you. What kind of story? Corporate fraud, elder abuse, and the planned destruction of a community anchor business. Are you interested? There was a pause. I'm very interested. When can we meet? Tomorrow morning. And Miles, bring a good photographer. This is going to be front page material. As I hung up, I felt something shift inside me. 4 weeks, I had been reacting to Brandon's moves, responding to his initiatives, defending against his attacks. It was time to stop playing defense. Andrew had always said that the best business strategy was to control the narrative. Define the terms of engagement before your opponent realizes the game has started. Brandon thought he was maneuvering an elderly woman into a corner. He was about to discover that he was facing a businesswoman with 35 years of experience, a clear understanding of her legal position, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The war for Whitford logistics was about to begin in earnest. The meeting with Miles Booker took place at a small cafe 20 minutes outside Cedar Ridge, far enough from town to avoid unwanted attention, but close enough that I could drive there without raising questions about my capabilities. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where I could see the entrance and speak privately. Miles arrived precisely on time, carrying a digital recorder and a leather portfolio that suggested he took this meeting seriously. He was younger than I'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that marked ambitious journalists who hadn't yet become cynical about the stories they covered. Mrs. Whitford, thank you for reaching out. I have to admit, when you mentioned corporate fraud and elder abuse, I was intrigued. Whitford logistics has always been one of our region's success stories. That's exactly why this story matters, I said, sliding a folder across the table. Everything you need to verify what I'm about to tell you is in there. Medical records, corporate documents, recorded phone calls, witness statements. Miles opened the folder and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. I had spent the previous evening organizing the evidence chronologically, creating a narrative that even someone unfamiliar with corporate governance could follow. This is substantial, he said after reviewing the first few documents. You're alleging that your son is attempting to have you declared incompetent in order to complete a merger that would destroy the company and eliminate hundreds of jobs. I'm not alleging anything. I'm documenting what has already happened and what is scheduled to happen by November 1st. Miles continued reading, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific documents or timelines. When he reached the medical records, his eyebrows rose. These consultation notes are remarkably convenient for someone building a case for incompetence. Read the independent medical evaluation on the next page. He did, and I watched his expression shift from professional skepticism to personal outrage. Good journalists had finely tuned instincts for injustice, and Miles was clearly a good journalist. Mrs. Whitford, if even half of this is accurate, it's not just a business story. It's criminal fraud, elder abuse, and corporate malfeasance on a scale that would destroy multiple careers. It's all accurate. But more importantly, it's preventable. The merger deadline is Monday. If this story runs before then, the acquiring company will likely withdraw their offer rather than risk association with this kind of scandal. What's your goal here? Justice, revenge, corporate control. It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since deciding to go public. My goal is to protect 300 employees and their families from losing their jobs, so my son can profit from destroying something his father and I spent 35 years building. Miles closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. I'll need to verify the documentation, interview other sources, confirm the medical claims. How quickly do you need this story? The weekend edition, if possible, Monday morning at the latest. That's ambitious, but doable if everything checks out. He paused. Mrs. Whitford, once this story runs, there's no going back. Your relationship with your son will be permanently damaged. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Brandon as a child, the boy who used to help me organize my desk at the office, who would sit in board meetings drawing pictures while Andrew and I discussed business strategy. When had that eager child become someone capable of such calculated betrayal? My relationship with my son was damaged the moment he decided I was expendable, I said. This story won't change that. It will just make it public. Miles spent the next hour asking detailed questions about specific documents, taking notes, and outlining his verification process. He was thorough and professional, but I could see the excitement building behind his careful journalist demeanor. This was the kind of story that could make a career. I'll start making calls this afternoon, he said as we prepared to leave. If you think of anything else, or if the situation changes in any way, call me immediately. Miles, one more thing. When you interview my son, and you should definitely interview him, be careful. He's very good at controlling narratives and managing his image. Don't let him frame this as a concerned child worried about an aging parent. What should I frame? It as a corporate executive committing fraud to steal a company and eliminate its workforce for personal profit. After Miles left, I drove home feeling both exhilarated and terrified. I had just set in motion a series of events that would either save my company or destroy my family. Probably both. That afternoon, Lena called with an update on her investigation into the merger documents. I found some additional information that you're going to find interesting, she said. The acquiring company, National Freight Consolidated, has a history of these kinds of deals. They've acquired and dismantled 7 regional companies in the past 3 years, always following the same pattern. What pattern? They identify family-owned companies with aging leadership, exploit succession conflicts to acquire control at below market prices, then break up the operations and sell the assets. It's quite profitable and perfectly legal as long as they don't actively create the succession conflicts. But if they did actively create the succession conflicts, then it becomes conspiracy to commit fraud, and both they and their local collaborators would face serious criminal charges. I felt a chill of understanding. Brandon didn't develop this plan independently. I don't think so. The timing is too precise, the medical documentation too convenient, the legal strategy too sophisticated. Someone with experience in these kinds of takeovers has been coaching him. Can you prove that? Not yet. But if the journalist you're working with can establish communication between Brandon and National Freight before your supposed medical decline, that would be very damaging to both parties. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Daniela, Brandon's wife. We hadn't spoken in several weeks. Not since she had stopped coming to family dinners with increasingly transparent excuses. Victoria, I hope you don't mind me calling. I wanted to check on how you're doing. I'm doing well, dear. How are you? I single quote some ... confused. Actually, Brandon has been making a lot of changes lately. and I'm having trouble understanding what's happening. I chose my words carefully. What kind of changes? He's been having a lot of late-night phone calls with people I don't recognize. He's moved money around in ways that don't make sense to me. And he's been talking about you in ways that don't match the woman I know. What has he been saying about me? There was a long pause. He's been telling people that you're experiencing significant cognitive decline, that you've been making poor decisions about your health and finances. But when I see you, you seem exactly the same as always. Daniela, do you have access to Brandon's office computer or his business files? Some of them. Why? If you've seen anything that concerns you, anything that doesn't seem right, I think you should document it. Print copies, save emails, whatever you think might be important. Victoria, are you saying that Brandon is lying about your condition? I'm saying that you should trust your own judgment about what you're seeing and hearing. Another long pause. I'll call you tomorrow. After I hung up, I realized that Brandon's plan was beginning to unravel. Miles would verify the documentation and publish his story. Lena was building a legal case that would expose the conspiracy. And now Daniela was questioning the narrative Brandon had been constructing. But I also realized that Brandon would be getting desperate as his deadline approached. Desperate people made dangerous decisions, and I was still living alone in a house where he had access and authority. I called Maya Chen at Willow Acres. Maya, if someone were to try to admit me to your facility against my will, what would that process look like? It would require either a court order or signed authorization from someone with legal authority to make medical decisions on your behalf. What if someone presented forged documents? We'd have no way to verify them immediately. If someone arrived with what appeared to be proper paperwork and a medical emergency, we'd probably admit first and verify later. I thanked her and hung up, then called Lena's emergency number. Lena, I need you to file paperwork tomorrow morning revoking any medical power of attorney documents Brandon might have. I also need you to notify all local hospitals and care facilities that I am competent to make my own medical decisions and that any emergency placement should be verified with you directly. Victoria, what's happened? Nothing yet. But I have a feeling Monday is going to be a very interesting day. As I prepared for bed that night, I took one more walk through the house Andrew and I had built together. Tomorrow, the war for our legacy would become public. By Monday, the fate of our company and our community would be decided. I had done everything I could to protect what we had built. Now I had to wait and see whether it would be enough. Friday morning brought the sound of rain against the windows and an early phone call from Miles Booker. Double quotes, Mrs. Whitford. I've been working on verification all night. Every document you gave me checks out, and I've confirmed most of your timeline through independent sources. I'm ready to run the story. What did you find? Phone records showing regular communication between Brandon and National Freight Consolidated, dating back 3 months, well before your alleged medical episodes. Financial records confirming the asset liquidation plan, and an interview with a former employee of National Freight who described their standard operating procedure for acquiring family businesses through succession disputes. I felt a surge of satisfaction. When will it run? Tomorrow's weekend edition. Front page. But I wanted to give you a heads up. I tried to reach Brandon for comment yesterday, and his response was ... interesting. What did he say? He denied the allegations, naturally. But then he said something that struck me as significant. He claimed that you'd been experiencing paranoid delusions lately, and that this interview was evidence of your deteriorating mental state. He's trying to discredit me preemptively. That's what I thought. But it also suggests he knows this story is coming and he's preparing a defense strategy. After Miles hung up, I spent the morning implementing the security measures Lena and I had discussed. I changed the locks on the house, updated my emergency contacts at the bank, and my doctor's office, and arranged for Aunt Aber to check on me regularly throughout the week and at noon. Daniela arrived at my door carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression of barely controlled anger. "I brought you something," she said, stepping into the foyer and looking around as if she expected to find evidence of the cognitive decline Brandon had been describing. "What is it?" "Copies of emails from Brandon's office computer. I think you should read them." We sat in the living room while I reviewed the documents she had brought. The emails painted a clear picture of coordination between Brandon and National Freight that went back for months. Strategy discussions, timeline coordination, even suggestions about how to document medical concerns that would support a competency challenge. One email thread was particularly damaging. It showed Brandon asking for advice about how to expedite the transition process for an aging family member who was resistant to necessary changes. The responses included recommendations for specific medical language that would support assisted living placement and suggestions for legal strategies that would minimize potential challenges. "Daniela, how did you access these emails?" Brandon asked me to organize his office files last week. He wanted everything ready for some kind of transition, though he wasn't specific about what kind. "I made copies of anything that seemed unusual. What will you do now? I'm leaving him." Her voice was matter-of-fact, but I could see the pain behind her composure. "I can't be married to someone capable of this. And I won't be complicit in the destruction of your company and the jobs of people we know. Where will you go?" "My sister's house in Richmond, at least temporarily. But first, I'm going to give a copy of these emails to that journalist you've been working with." That afternoon, while I was reviewing additional documents in Andrew's study, Maya Chen called from Willow Acres. "Mrs. Whitford, your son is here." Again, he brought a woman with him this time, someone he introduced as your niece from out of state. "They're asking about emergency admission procedures. I don't have a niece." "I didn't think so. She doesn't seem to know much about your family when I ask specific questions. And she keeps deferring to your son about details." "What are they saying?" "That you had an episode this morning, that you became confused and agitated, and that your doctor is recommending immediate placement for your own safety." I felt my heart rate increase. Brandon was accelerating his timeline, probably because he had learned about the newspaper story or because Daniela's absence had alerted him to potential problems. "Maya, what did you tell them?" "That our policy requires direct communication with potential residents before any admission, regardless of the circumstances. I said we'd need to speak with you personally to verify that placement was something you wanted, and..." Your son became quite agitated. He said that expecting you to make rational decisions about your care was exactly the kind of thinking that had created this crisis. The woman with him suggested that we were being unreasonably bureaucratic about what was clearly a medical emergency. "What happens next?" "They left, but they said they'd be back this evening with additional medical documentation." "Mrs. Whitford, I'm not comfortable with this situation. Their behavior feels more like a kidnapping plan than a medical intervention." After I hung up, I called Lena and explained what was happening. "This is escalating faster than we expected," she said. "If Brandon is planning to forcibly admit you somewhere, we need to take preventive action immediately." "What kind of preventive action?" "I'm filing an emergency motion for a protective order. It will prevent Brandon from making any medical decisions on your behalf and will require court approval for any changes to your living situation." "How quickly can you get that filed?" "I'm working on it now, but Victoria, you shouldn't be alone. Tonight, is there somewhere safe you can stay?" I thought about my options. Teresa Franklin at Willow Acres had offered to help in any way she could. Maya Chen clearly supported my position, but neither of them could provide the kind of security I might need if Brandon was planning something desperate. "I'll figure something out," I said. But Lena, if something happens to me before Monday, make sure that story still runs. Nothing is going to happen to you. We won't let it. That evening, as rain continued to fall and darkness settled over the estate, I found myself thinking about the choice between safety and principle. I could leave the house, stay with friends, hide until the legal and media pressure forced Brandon to abandon his plan. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice, but it would also mean abandoning the home Andrew and I had built, surrendering the space where we had made the decisions that shaped our company and our community. It would mean letting fear drive me from the place where I felt most like myself. I was 65 years old, not 95. I was legally competent, financially independent, and surrounded by allies who understood what was at stake. If I started running from my own son, where would it end? Instead of leaving, I did something that would have made Andrew proud. I prepared for a fight. I gathered all the important documents, medical records, corporate papers, legal authorizations, and secured them in Andrew's office safe. I called Miles Booker and gave him additional contact information in case something happened to me before the story ran. I contacted Maya Chen and asked her to document any further visits from Brandon or his associates. Then I sat in Andrew's chair, in the study where we had planned our business strategy for 35 years, and waited to see what my son would do. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the windows and rain drumming against the roof. But inside, surrounded by the evidence of a life built on principle and hard work, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. I felt ready. The newspaper hit the stands at 6 a.m. Saturday morning. Miles had sent me an advance copy by email the night before, and seeing the story in print was both satisfying and terrifying. The headline read, "Local Business Dynasty Faces Elder Abuse Scandal," with a subhead that captured the essence perfectly. Son allegedly fabricates medical crisis to steal mother's company. The article was comprehensive and damning. Miles had verified every major claim, interviewed multiple sources, and presented the evidence in a way that made Brandon's actions seem both methodical and despicable. The story included quotes from medical experts about the suspicious nature of my consultation records, legal experts about the complexity of the merger timeline, and business analysts about the likely impact on local employment. Most importantly, it included recent photographs of me looking alert, competent, and nowhere near the confused elderly woman Brandon had been describing to various parties. My phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. The first call was from Teresa Franklin at Willow Acres, Victoria. "I just read the most fascinating article in today's paper. I had no idea you were such a formidable businesswoman. I'm still learning how formidable I am. Well, you've certainly gotten everyone's attention. The staff here is buzzing about it. And Maya asked me to tell you that several people called the facility overnight asking questions about your supposed medical condition." "What kind of people?" "Reporters, mostly, but also some business associates who wanted to verify whether you were actually incompetent or whether someone had been spreading false information." The second call was from Lena, calling from her office despite the early Saturday hour. "Victoria, the protective order has been approved and filed. Brandon cannot make any medical decisions on your behalf, and any attempt to change your living situation without court approval would constitute kidnapping. Have you heard from Brandon or his lawyers?" "Not yet, but I expect to hear something soon." This newspaper story has created a public relations catastrophe for both Brandon and National Freight. They're going to need to respond quickly. The third call was from Miles Booker. Double quotes, "Mrs. Whitford. The story is getting significant attention. I've had calls from 3 other newspapers, to television stations, and a freelance investigative reporter who's working on a book about corporate elder abuse. Are you prepared for this level of scrutiny?" "I'm prepared for whatever it takes to protect my company and my employees. There's something else. I got a call this morning from someone at National Freight Consolidated. They're claiming this whole story is fabricated by a mentally unstable woman who's trying to sabotage her son's legitimate business decisions. What did you tell them? I told them I'd verified every major claim through multiple independent sources, and that any further statements suggesting you're mentally unstable could constitute defamation given the medical evidence I've reviewed. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and was generating commentary on business websites across Virginia. The narrative had shifted completely from concerned son caring for aging mother to corporate executive attempts, fraud through elder abuse. But Brandon still hadn't called. That afternoon, Daniela arrived at my door carrying 2 suitcases and looking exhausted. I wanted to update you before I leave for Richmond, she said. Brandon came home last night after the story broke online. How did he react? Like someone whose carefully constructed plan had just exploded in his face? He spent most of the night on the phone with lawyers and crisis management consultants, trying to figure out how to control the damage. What did he say about me? Nothing good. He's convinced that you've orchestrated this entire situation to humiliate him and destroy his business prospects. He can't seem to grasp that his own actions created this problem. Daniela sat down heavily in one of the living room chairs. Victoria, I need to tell you something else. Brandon wasn't working alone on this plan. I know about National Freight Consolidated. It's more than that. There's a consulting firm that specializes in what they call succession facilitation. For family businesses, they've been coaching Brandon for months on how to position you as incompetent and how to structure the merger to minimize legal challenges. Do you have documentation of that relationship? Some email correspondence, consulting agreements, strategy documents. I made copies before I left. She handed me another manila envelope. Brandon is planning to claim that you hired this same consulting firm to help you fabricate evidence against him. I felt a chill of understanding. He's going to argue that this entire situation is a conspiracy I created to maintain control of the company. That's exactly what he's going to argue. His lawyers think they can reframe this as a competency dispute, where both sides have manufactured evidence to support their positions. What does that mean practically? It means this fight is going to get much uglier before it's resolved. After Daniela left for Richmond, I spent the evening reviewing the new documents she had provided. The consulting firm, Strategic Succession Solutions, had indeed been coaching Brandon on every aspect of his plan. But their own documentation revealed something Brandon probably didn't realize. They had used almost identical strategies with at least 6 other family businesses in the past 2 years. I called Miles Booker with this new information. This is bigger than one family dispute, I told him. This is a systematic business model based on exploiting family conflicts to enable corporate takeovers. How much documentation do you have? Enough to establish a pattern, names, dates, strategies, outcomes. If you can connect with families from those other businesses, you might find a much larger story. Mrs. Whitford, if this is as widespread as you're suggesting, it could have national implications. Corporate elder abuse as a business strategy would be a major investigative piece. Then you should investigate it. But first, help me make sure my company and my employees are protected. That night, as I prepared for bed in the house I shared with 43 years of memories, I reflected on how completely my life had changed in the space of a few weeks. 3 weeks ago, I had been a retired widow planning to spend her golden years traveling and doing charity work. Now I was the center of a corporate scandal that was generating statewide media attention. The transformation had been jarring, but not unwelcome. For the first time since Andrew's death, I felt fully engaged with the world around me. I felt like myself again, not the diminished version of myself that everyone seemed to expect from a 65-year-old widow, but the sharp, strategic, Woman who would help build a multimillion-dollar company from scratch. Tomorrow was Sunday. Monday, Brandon would have to decide whether to proceed with his merger deadline or abandon the plan entirely. Either choice would have consequences that would reshape our family and our business permanently. But tonight, in the study where Andrew and I had planned our future together, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: confidence in my own strength and certainty about my own choices. Whatever happened next, I was ready for it. Sunday morning brought crystal clear skies and an unusual silence from my phone. After days of constant calls from reporters, lawyers, and business associates, the quiet felt ominous. I spent the morning in Andrew's study, organizing documents and preparing for what I expected would be a decisive Monday. At 11 o'clock, Maya Chen called from Willow Acres. "Mrs. Whitford, I wanted to give you a heads up. Your son arrived here about an hour ago with 2 men in suits and a woman who identified herself as a crisis intervention specialist. What did they want? They're claiming that yesterday's newspaper story was fabricated by you during a psychotic episode, and that they have new medical evidence supporting immediate involuntary commitment." I felt my pulse quicken. What kind of medical evidence? They showed me what they claimed was an updated psychiatric evaluation indicating that you're experiencing paranoid delusions and pose a danger to yourself and others. They want to arrange emergency placement here while they pursue legal guardianship. Maya, I had an independent medical evaluation on Tuesday. I'm completely competent. I know. That's why I told them we'd need to verify any new medical documentation with your primary physician before proceeding. But Mrs. Whitford, they seemed very confident about their legal position. After Maya hung up, I immediately called Lena's emergency number. "They're escalating again," I told her. "Brandon is apparently claiming I'm psychotic and dangerous. That's interesting timing," Lena said grimly. "I just received a call from Brandon's attorney. They're filing an emergency petition for guardianship this afternoon, claiming that yesterday's newspaper story demonstrates your deteriorating mental state and your inability to make rational decisions. Can they do that? They can try, but the medical evidence would have to be extraordinary to overcome the independent evaluation you had done, plus the protective order I filed yesterday." Maya said they have new psychiatric documentation. "Victoria, did you see any psychiatrist this week other than Dr. Chen?" "No, then any psychiatric evaluation they're presenting is either falsified or based on a consultation you weren't aware of. Either way, it won't hold up in court." But I was beginning to understand that Brandon's strategy had evolved beyond legal victory. If he could create enough chaos and confusion around my mental state, he might be able to proceed with the merger while the competency dispute was being resolved. Corporate partners often prefer to deal with clear authority figures rather than wait for legal proceedings to conclude. I called Miles Booker to alert him about these new developments. "This actually strengthens your position," Miles said after I explained Brandon's latest moves. Fabricating psychiatric evidence is a serious crime, and attempting to have someone involuntarily committed based on false documentation could result in criminal charges. What should I do? Document everything. Record any interactions with Brandon or his associates. And consider making a statement to the police about attempted fraud. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, my doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Brandon standing on the porch with 2 people I didn't recognize: a middle-aged woman in professional attire and a younger man who looked like he might be a lawyer or investigator. I opened the door, but didn't invite them in. "Hello, Brandon. Mom, we need to talk. This situation has gotten completely out of hand." "I agree. Your attempt to steal my company and destroy 300 jobs is definitely out of hand." The woman stepped forward. "Mrs. Whitford, I'm Dr. Patricia Kellerman, a licensed psychiatric social worker. I understand you've been experiencing some confusion lately about business and family relationships. I haven't been experiencing any confusion, but I am curious about who you are and why you think you're qualified to make assessments about my mental state. Your son contacted our office because he's concerned about some recent behaviors that suggest you might be having difficulty distinguishing between reality and paranoid fantasies. I looked at Brandon, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The concerned expression he was wearing was carefully constructed, the kind of performance he had perfected in business presentations when he needed to convince skeptical clients. Brandon, is this really the path you want to take? Manufacturing psychiatric evidence, falsifying medical records, attempting to have your own mother involuntarily committed. Mom, you've been telling people that I'm trying to steal your company. You've convinced yourself that I'm involved in some kind of conspiracy. These are classic symptoms of paranoid delusion in elderly people experiencing cognitive decline. What's classic is adult children who think they can manipulate aging parents into surrendering their assets and their autonomy. I turned to Dr. Kellerman. I assume you've reviewed my medical records. I've reviewed the documentation your son provided. Have you seen the independent medical evaluation I had done this week by Dr. Sarah Chen at UVA Medical Center? Her slight hesitation told me she hadn't. Mr. Whitford didn't mention an independent evaluation. I'm sure he didn't, Dr. Kellerman. Before you make any professional judgments about my mental state, I suggest you review all available medical evidence, not just the carefully selected documents my son has chosen to share with you. The younger man stepped forward. Mrs. Whitford, I'm David Reeves, representing the family in this matter. We're prepared to file papers this afternoon for emergency guardianship if you continue to resist the medical intervention your son is trying to arrange, Mr. Reeves. Are you aware that I have a protective order preventing my son from making any medical decisions on my behalf? We're aware of your attempts to prevent your family from getting you the care you need. But Judge Morrison has agreed to review our emergency petition this afternoon. Judge Morrison. I knew him professionally. He had handled several business disputes for Whitford Logistics over the years, and it always struck me as a thoughtful, careful jurist. If Brandon was confident about getting a hearing with Judge Morrison on a Sunday afternoon, he had either misrepresented the urgency of the situation or had presented compelling evidence that I was genuinely dangerous. What exactly are you alleging in your emergency petition? I asked. Brandon answered. That you've become paranoid and delusional, that you're making irrational business decisions that could harm hundreds of employees, and that you're refusing medical intervention that could help stabilize your condition, and you have medical evidence supporting these allegations. We have documentation from multiple sources indicating significant cognitive decline and behavioral changes consistent with age-related dementia or psychiatric disorder. I realized that Brandon had constructed a narrative that was internally consistent and might be persuasive to someone who didn't know the full context. An elderly woman accusing her devoted son of conspiracy to steal her company, rejecting medical advice, generating negative publicity that could harm a family business. It could indeed look like paranoid delusion to someone who hadn't seen the underlying evidence. Dr. Kellerman, I said, I'm going to make this very simple for you. I'm willing to submit to a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation by any qualified professional you choose, as long as it's conducted according to standard clinical protocols and documented with full transparency. That's not necessary, Brandon interjected quickly. We already have sufficient medical documentation. Actually, Dr. Kellerman said, a standardized evaluation would be the appropriate next step if Mrs. Whitford is willing to cooperate. I could see Brandon's carefully constructed plan beginning to unravel. He needed me to appear uncooperative and resistant to medical intervention. My willingness to submit to professional evaluation undermined his narrative completely. I'm not just willing to cooperate, I said. I insist on it. But I also insist that any evaluation include a review of all medical evidence, including the independent assessment I had done this week that found no cognitive impairment whatsoever. Dr. Kellerman looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Mr. Whitford, you didn't mention that your mother had already undergone recent evaluation. Because it was conducted by doctors she specifically chose to support her position, Brandon said. We need an objective assessment by professionals who haven't been influenced by her version of events. Dr. Chen at UVA Medical Center is one of the most respected geriatric psychiatrists in Virginia, I said. If you're questioning her professional competence, you should say so directly. At that point, I saw Dr. Kellerman make a decision. Mrs. Whitford, based on this conversation, I don't see evidence supporting emergency intervention. You appear alert, oriented, and capable of making informed decisions about your medical care. I would recommend that any competency evaluation follow standard procedures rather than emergency protocols. Brandon's face darkened. Dr. Kellerman, we hired your services to provide professional assessment, not to be manipulated by someone who's clearly experiencing psychiatric difficulties. Mr. Whitford, I've been working in geriatric psychiatry for 20 years. I know the difference between mental illness and family conflict. What I'm seeing here appears to be the latter. After they left, I sat in my living room and allowed myself to feel the full emotional impact of what had just occurred. My own son had arrived at my home with strangers, attempting to have me declared mentally ill and forcibly removed from my house based on fabricated evidence. The betrayal was complete. Now, whatever relationship Brandon and I had shared was finished, destroyed by his willingness to use my love for him as a weapon against me. But I also felt something else, clarity. The fight was no longer about business or money or family dynamics. It was about fundamental questions of dignity, autonomy, and justice. I picked up the phone and called the police. I'd like to report an attempted fraud, I said when the dispatcher answered. Someone has been fabricating medical records and attempting to have me forcibly committed based on false documentation. Mum, can you provide more details about the nature of the fraud? I can provide extensive documentation. How soon can an officer be here? Within 2 hours. I had filed a formal complaint with the Cedar Ridge Police Department, providing copies of all the medical records, corporate documents, and email evidence I had gathered. The investigating officer, Detective Sarah Walsh, was thorough and professional and seemed particularly interested in the pattern of document falsification. Mrs. Whitford, based on what you've shown me, this appears to be a systematic attempt to defraud you of corporate assets through false claims about your mental capacity. We'll need to investigate the medical records to determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. Detective, what happens if my son proceeds with his emergency guardianship petition? If he's presenting falsified medical evidence to a judge, that would constitute additional criminal charges. But more importantly, if we can demonstrate that the medical documentation is fraudulent, any guardianship petition based on that documentation would be dismissed immediately. That evening, I received calls from 3 different television news stations requesting interviews about the corporate elder abuse scandal. The story had grown beyond local business news into a broader narrative about family betrayal, corporate fraud, and the vulnerability of aging Americans to financial exploitation. I agreed to one television interview, scheduled for Monday morning. It was time to tell my story directly, in my own words, to an audience that could judge for themselves whether I appeared to be a confused elderly woman or a competent business woman defending her life's work dad. As I prepared for bed that night, I thought about the choice I had made to fight publicly rather than quietly. Andrew had always believed that sunlight was the best disinfectant for corruption, that bringing problems into the open was usually preferable to trying to solve them behind closed doors. Tomorrow, Brandon would have to decide whether to proceed. With his merger deadline in the face of criminal investigation, media scrutiny, and public exposure of his methods, he could still try to complete the deal, but it would mean associating National Freight Consolidated with a scandal that was growing larger by the day. More likely, he would try to find a way to retreat while saving face, perhaps claiming that he had been misled by advisors or that his genuine concern for my welfare had been misinterpreted. Either way, the company Andrew and I had built was safe. The 300 employees who depended on Whitford Logistics for their livelihoods would keep their jobs. The community anchor we had created would continue to support Cedar Ridge's economy. I had won. But the victory felt bittersweet because it had required destroying the last remnants of my relationship with my son Dodd in the quiet of the house I had shared with Andrew for so many years. I allowed myself to grieve not just for the relationship I had lost, but for the person I had thought Brandon was, the boy who had sat in my office drawing pictures while I worked, the young man who had seemed so eager to carry on his father's legacy, the son I had trusted with everything I had built. That person had never really existed or had been lost somewhere along the way to the ambitious, entitled man who had tried to steal my life's work for personal gain. But I had survived his betrayal. More than that, I had fought back successfully and had protected the people and principles that mattered most to me. At 65, I was beginning a new chapter of my life, not as a diminished widow being managed by others, but as a woman who had rediscovered her own strength and refused to surrender her autonomy to anyone's expectations about aging gracefully. The battle for Whitford Logistics was over. The war for my own dignity and independence had been won. Now I had to figure out how to live with the consequences of victory. The telephone interview with Channel 7 News aired Monday morning at 8 o'clock, reaching the peak commuter audience across Central Virginia. I had prepared carefully for the interview, choosing my words to convey both the facts of the situation and my own competence to speak about those facts. The interviewer, Rebecca Martinez, was professional but direct. Mrs. Whitford, your son claims that your recent allegations against him are the result of paranoid delusions brought on by age-related cognitive decline. How do you respond to that? I respond with medical evidence, I said, holding up the independent evaluation from Dr. Chen. Last Tuesday, I underwent comprehensive cognitive testing by one of Virginia's most respected geriatric psychiatrists. The results show no evidence of cognitive decline, paranoid thinking, or any condition that would affect my ability to make rational decisions about my business or my life. But the medical records your son has presented suggest ongoing concerns about your mental state. Those medical records contain documented lies. They describe consultations I never had and symptoms I never experienced. If someone is fabricating medical evidence to support claims about my incompetence, the question isn't whether I'm paranoid, it's whether someone is committing fraud. What do you think motivated your son's actions? A $30-7 million company and his willingness to destroy it for personal profit. The interview continued for 12 minutes, during which I methodically presented the evidence of Brandon's coordination with National Freight, the fabricated medical documentation, and the timeline that showed his medical concerns had emerged only when he needed them to support his corporate plans. By the time the interview concluded, I had accomplished two goals. I had demonstrated my own competence to anyone willing to listen, and I had made it clear that Brandon's actions constituted criminal fraud rather than family concern. The response was immediate. My phone started ringing before 9 o'clock with calls from business partners, employees, community leaders, and friends who had seen the interview and wanted to express their support. The most significant call came at 10:30 from Jack Morrison, The CEO of National Freight Consolidated, Mrs. Whitford. I'm calling to inform you that National Freight is withdrawing from any potential merger discussions with Whitford Logistics, I see. May I ask why, frankly, the circumstances surrounding this proposed deal have become untenable? We can't proceed with a merger when there are questions about fraud, elder abuse, and criminal activity on the part of our potential partner. What about Brandon's position as CEO? Mr. Whitford's employment with National Freight was contingent on the successful completion of the merger. Since we're no longer pursuing that merger, his employment offer has been withdrawn. After Morrison hung up, I sat in Andrew's study and allowed myself to feel the full scope of what had just happened. The merger was dead. The threat to our company and our employees was over. Brandon's grand plan had collapsed completely, but I also knew that Brandon would not accept defeat gracefully. He had risked everything on this strategy, had burned bridges and destroyed relationships in pursuit of what he thought would be a decisive victory. People who had gambled everything rarely withdrew quietly when they lost. The call I was expecting came at noon. Mother, Brandon's voice was cold, controlled, empty of any pretense of familial affection. Hello, Brandon. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. I'm satisfied that I've protected my company and my employees from someone who was planning to destroy both for personal gain. You've destroyed my career, my marriage, and my future prospects because you couldn't accept that it was time for you to step aside gracefully. I destroyed nothing, Brandon. You did that yourself when you decided to commit fraud rather than earn what you wanted through honest work. This isn't over. Yes, it is. The merger is dead, the criminal investigation is proceeding, and your employment options are limited by the fact that you're now publicly associated with corporate fraud and elder abuse. You think you've won, but you've actually lost everything. That matters. You've lost your son, your family, any hope of a peaceful retirement. Was it worth it? The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself thinking carefully about the answer. Brandon, when you were 7 years old, you asked me why your father, and I worked so late every night. I told you that we were building something that would last, something that would take care of our family and our community long after we were gone. Do you remember that conversation? No, I thought you might not, but I remember it because it was the moment I realized I was working not just for myself or even for your father, but for you and for the people whose livelihoods depended on our success. Mother, I'm not finished. 35 years later, you decided that what we built was worth destroying if it meant personal profit for you. You were willing to eliminate 300 jobs, lie about my medical condition, and commit fraud to get what you wanted. So when you ask me if this was worth it, I have to ask you, when did you stop caring about anything except yourself? There was a long silence. I was trying to save the company from your emotional decision-making and outdated business practices. Brandon said, finally, you were trying to steal the company and liquidate it for parts. There's a difference. I was trying to secure my future. You were trying to steal mine. I'm your son, yes, and I'm your mother. And I taught you better than this. After I hung up, I walked through the house one more time, room by room, thinking about the conversation I had just had with the child I had raised and loved for 38 years. Brandon had asked whether my victory was worth the cost, and the honest answer was that I didn't know yet. I had preserved my company, protected my employees, and maintained my autonomy, but I had also lost my son, possibly permanently. The trade-off seemed necessary but not satisfying. I had won a war, but the victory fell hollow because the enemy had been someone I loved. That afternoon, Lena came by with final legal documents confirming my control of Whitford Logistics and updating the corporate governance structure to prevent future challenges to my authority. It's over, she said, organizing the papers on the dining room table. Brandon has no legal standing to challenge your competence. no corporate authority to negotiate mergers, and no realistic prospect of overturning any of these through the courts. What about the criminal investigation? Detective Walsh thinks. The fraud charges are solid: falsifying medical records, attempting to file false guardianship papers, conspiracy to commit corporate fraud. Brandon is looking at serious felony charges if the district attorney decides to prosecute. Will they prosecute? Probably. This case has gotten too much public attention to ignore, and the evidence is overwhelming. That evening, Maya Chen called from Willow Acres to check on me. "I saw your television interview this morning," she said. "You did a good job presenting your case. Thank you. Maya, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you did to help me through this situation. I was just doing my job." "But Mrs. Whitford, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What happens now? Do you go back to your retirement? Or do you return to running the company?" It was a question I had been avoiding, but one that I needed to answer soon. For 3 years since Andrew's death, I had been gradually withdrawing from active involvement in Whitford Logistics, assuming that Brandon would eventually take full responsibility for the company's future. Now, with Brandon gone and facing criminal charges, I was once again the primary decision-maker for a multimillion-dollar business with hundreds of employees. I could hire professional management and return to my planned retirement, or I could resume active leadership of the company I'd helped create. "I think," I said slowly, "I'm going to find out whether a 65-year-old woman can still run a freight company." "I think you'll find out that age is less important than competence," Maya replied. "And you've certainly demonstrated your competence over the past few weeks." After I hung up, I walked into Andrew's study and sat in his chair for what I realized would be the last time. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of transitioning this space from a shrine to his memory into my active office. I had some calls to make to key employees, some strategic decisions to consider about the company's future direction, and some thinking to do about what kind of leader I wanted to be in this unexpected phase of my career. The fight for Whitford Logistics was over, but the work of rebuilding and moving forward was just beginning. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I thought about the letter I had never written, the one Brandon had feared, the devastating communication that could have destroyed his plans with a single stroke. In the end, I hadn't needed to write that letter. I had defended my company and my dignity through transparency, evidence, and the support of people who believed in justice over convenience. But I had learned something important about myself during this crisis. I was stronger, more resilient, and more capable than I had given myself credit for. The assumptions about aging and diminished capacity that had nearly cost me everything were just that, assumptions, not realities. At 65, I was not ending my career. I was beginning a new chapter, one where I would lead with the wisdom of experience and the confidence that comes from having survived betrayal and emerged stronger. The last thing I did before going to sleep was write a letter. After all, not the devastating communication Brandon had feared, but a letter to the employees of Whitford Logistics, informing them that their jobs were secure, that the company would continue to operate according to the principles Andrew and I had established, and that I would be resuming active leadership to ensure that our shared legacy would endure. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of rebuilding trust, restoring stability, and moving forward. Tonight, I would rest in the knowledge that I had fought for what mattered and had won. The boy I had raised was gone, lost to ambition and selfishness. But the company we had built together, the community we had supported, and the principles we had championed would survive. At 65, I had discovered that it was not too late to start over, not too late to fight for what was right, and not too late to prove that age and wisdom could triumph over youth and treachery. My son had tried to bury me in a nursing home so he could steal my life's work. Instead, he had reminded me who I really was. Up next, we have to more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.